I think when things are not working in development, an almost reflexive response to that is to say, oh, there's either a lack of political will or there's a capacity problem. But by capacity, we usually mean or infer that it's something to do with the individuals. So we can then construct training programs of one kind or another, and then people are capacitized to do something that we now think they've learned a new skill, they've acquired a familiarity with the new operating system, whatever. And so that becomes the bureaucratic or operational response to some kind of failure or just anticipating a problem. We think that we need to invest in capacity. And the work that I've been involved in with many different colleagues, but especially with colleagues at the Kennedy School for the last few years, has all been about trying to say, look, we're trying to build the capability of systems, not just the capacity of individuals. If the problem is capacity of individuals, yes, we put them in school, we give them training courses, we do a whole bunch of stuff that teaches them how to know stuff. It's not about teaching how to know stuff, the systems need to do things, right? So everything from fixing potholes in roads to making sure that electricity functions 24/7, to making sure our food is safe and clean, that the water that we drink is also safe and clean, that airplanes will land and not crash when they take off. There's this vast array of extraordinarily high capability systems that we move in and out of every day in Western countries, and completely oblivion basically about how awesome and amazing they really are, because it is not obvious or routine across history and for most people now that you can safely buy food and eat it and know that it's not going to kill you, and drink water and know that it's not going to give you diarrhea, and you can breathe clean air. I mean, all these things are happening. I mean, catch a subway and know that you're not going to die in a horrible wreck underneath half a mile under the ground. I mean, all these things are just marvelous constructions, but they are not just done by well-trained individuals. They're maintained on a day-to-day seamless basis by systems that have developed their own organic capability to be able to do things, such that when people go on vacation, it doesn't really matter. The whole system keeps functioning. Whether people die, when the new recruits come in, World Bank, same way. We exist because the system we're part of functions on a day-to-day basis, not just whether some vice president comes and goes, or whether a new junior assistant comes in at the bottom end. I think the system keeps functioning, and that's what we really need to have as a much better strategy for building the capability of systems in developing countries, to not just see it as working specifically on individuals. And the tasks just keep getting more and more complicated and contentious. As countries get richer, they move from a world in which their initial task is building bridges and putting up infrastructure of one kind or another, or technocratic reforms, or groups problems that can be solved by a room full of smart people who can figure out how to get exchange rates and interest rates right, more or less, or you can craft a constitution. I mean, all those things are really important, but they're things that teams of relatively well-insulated people can do and can enact. Monetary policy is something that's largely determined by a group of a dozen or 24 people, and their job is to look at the data and make decisions about whether to raise or lower interest rates on the basis of what their own collective expertise tells them is the right thing to do. But that's not how you teach 1 million kids how to read and write. It's not how you provide basic curative healthcare to 10 million people. A system has to be functioning with huge amounts of human interaction for that to really work. And the hardest one of all is justice. The hardest thing, because most people want healthcare systems. Most people think it's a good idea to have a well-functioning healthcare system. But very powerful people often do not want a well-functioning justice system, and can usually enact very vicious forces to ensure that their same rules do not apply to everybody. That they have their own rules, and they're different from the rules that apply to everybody else. So you can get yourself, I think, to middle income status pretty much with a well-insulated bureaucracy doing what it's supposed to do, and paving the roads and building the schools, the things that are difficult, or still obviously, but are either known or knowable in terms of what needs to be done, or at worst can be exported. You can offload it to a contracting company to come and build your new highway, or to even set up taxation office or something. But the really difficult ones to do are the ones that really require a state to be able to function and do things that people would rather they didn't do. And this is where property taxes, or where criminal justice, and or regulating Fortune 500 companies, groups that can have very powerful pushback mechanisms that can undermine the whole thing. And in an ideal state, you have a countervailing set of forces, so that powerful people are held in check by forces that are able to actually do that. And whether you're watching Game of Thrones or any other show on TV, the world has taken a long time to figure out how to constrain very powerful people from doing what they could otherwise do shamelessly. And that's the most difficult task of all, is really figuring out how to constrain the most powerful forces that otherwise, left to their own devices, will not be doing things that are in the collective interest of society, though they may say that they are. So the work that we've been doing on justice is not just about understanding it from a local level and trying to really understand how different groups understand land, for example, but it's also recognizing that in the fullest sense you will have a system of land administration whereby there is a rational and modern approach to the management of that, and that everybody is subject to the same rules as everybody else. And so the capacity problem is sort of, how do you set up administrative records, a database of one kind or another that can actually do all of that. And then, yes, there's a lot of skills associated with learning how to do that and to maintain that and make it accessible to people. But that's a technical task, and people can learn that as individuals, and you can transfer those individuals around. For a system to work at full scale, you've got to have very different kind of learned collective skills that are in place, and those have to be very robust to very powerful forces that actively don't want them to do what their job is. And that's the bigger challenge that never goes away. Rich countries face that problem. The United States is facing that right now when there is some election season. Every rich country faces that. It's never solved. There is no answer to it. It's only what citizens are willing to keep pushing for to make that happen. And the big challenge from a development point of view is how outside agencies of one kind or another, whether it be the World Bank or anybody else, partners with domestic constituencies to help them learn how to build the capability of those systems to implement, whether it's delivering the mail, whether it's immunizing babies, whether it's educating teenagers, whether it's trying to improve the effectiveness of police officers. All of that is only partially transferable through what individuals do. Things, systems learn collectively the same way that we learn to do very difficult things like learning languages or musical instruments or sports. You learn them by doing them, not by studying them. And there has to be a very different modality for how we teach systems to learn, by getting systems to do incrementally more difficult tasks. But as long as we keep focusing on seeing capacity as something that individuals do rather than what systems do, then we're always going to be struggling, I think, to really see transformational change. We'll see money well spent, we'll see no big controversy necessarily, but if we really want to build the capability of a system, we've got to invest in and create space for systems to practice how to do complicated things.